The churchyard at Leyburn lay under a sky the color of pewter, and the frost had not yet lifted from the grass between the stones. It was the kind of morning that made the living walk quickly, heads down, anxious to be past the iron gate, and back among fires and voices. The Earl of Denton did not walk quickly. He moved through the churchyard the way he moved through every place that cost him something, which was with his hands loose at his sides and his jaw held steady and his eyes fixed on a point just ahead. He carried a small square of paper in his coat pocket. He always did. On these mornings, it was a pencil drawing, slightly foxed at the corners, of a kitchen garden in summer. Someone had drawn it with careful, unhurried lines, the way a person draws something they expect to look at for a long time. He had found it tucked into the back cover of a spelling primer in his ward's schoolroom, 6 months after the drowning. He had not known what to do with it, so he had put it in his pocket, and there it had stayed. He stopped before the stone. Margaret Ann Colville, beloved daughter. Taken from us, September 1814. He had stood here 9 times. He knew the particular lean of the stone, the patch of lichen creeping along the lower left corner, the way the morning light struck the carved letters and left the deeper cuts in shadow. He did not speak aloud. He had never found words adequate to this stone, or to the one beside it, which bore Eleanor's name, and he had stopped trying. He was reaching into his pocket for the drawing, as he always did, when he heard a sound behind him. Not the wind, not the gate. A breath, held and then released, the kind a person releases when they have made a decision that cannot be unmade. He turned. She was standing 3 feet away on the path between the yew trees, and she was alive. He knew her face. He had looked at it 100 times in the last year in memory, and in the particular grief of people who cannot precisely recall a voice but can reconstruct a face, line by line. He had thought his mind was playing him false. He had thought, standing very still in the frost, that loss produced visions in the weak-minded. She was not a vision. She was wearing a plain gray cloak, and her dark hair was pinned differently than he remembered, and her face was thinner, and her eyes were exactly as they had always been, steady and a little sad, and entirely present. "You buried an empty box," she said very quietly. The morning held still around them. The frost did not melt. The pewter sky did not brighten. He said nothing for a very long time. Margaret had not expected to be standing in this churchyard. She had told herself, on the long, cold walk from the village, that she would look at the stone and go. She had not counted on him being here. She had not counted on the drawing in his hand, half pulled from his coat pocket, its line so familiar that her throat had closed the moment she saw it. She was no one now. This was what her stepbrother Gerald had told her the last morning she had spent in her father's house, the solicitor's document open on the table between them. "Your father's debts have been settled against the estate. You will marry Harwick, or you will have nothing." She had looked at Gerald across the table and understood, with the particular clarity that comes to people who have run out of alternatives, that Gerald believed this absolutely, and that Harwick was the kind of man who made believing it easy. She had left before dawn. She had walked to the river in her heavy winter cloak, and she had left the cloak on the bank, weighted with stones, and she had walked north 8 miles in the cold, to the coaching road. She had been 23 years old. The report of her drowning had reached the village within the day. Gerald had identified the cloak. A fisherman's boy had seen her walking toward the water. The inquest had lasted 4 days and produced a verdict of accidental death and a headstone erected within the month, which Gerald had paid for, which Margaret had always found peculiar in its generosity. She had not meant to run so far, or to stay so long, or to become so thoroughly a different person that returning felt like a kind of violence. The first weeks she had slept in a room above a coaching inn at Ripon, spending down the small amount she had carried in her boot, and she had paid for the room with the last of it, and then found work at a draper's on the market square, folding cloth and writing invoices in a hand better suited to a drawing room than a counter. The draper had looked at the invoices and asked her no questions either. She had moved to Harrogate by October. She found lodgings with a landlady named Mrs. Bragen. Fowler, who rented to seamstresses and music teachers and women whose circumstances she had the decency not to inquire after too closely. She found work with a dressmaker on High Street, and then, when her eye for fine work became known, with the better households in the surrounding countryside, she was careful. She was neat. She did not go anywhere. She was likely to be recognized, and Harrogate was far enough from the Colville lands that the risk was small. She became Eliza Marsh thoroughly, which is to say, she wore the name like a well-made garment, one that fit in most places and pulled a little sometimes, in the night. She had a room with a proper window that looked over the stable yard, and a small iron stove and a tin of tea she replaced once a fortnight, and these things were hers in the specific way that things belong to a person who has had them only a short while and is not yet certain she deserves them. She had kept the drawing because she had drawn it herself, in the last summer before everything, sitting in the Colvilles' kitchen garden with Cecily Denton's hand in hers. She had loved the child. This was the fact she could not make orderly. The one that came to her in the small hours and did not leave. She had been companion to Cecily for 4 months, from May to September of the year before her so-called death, engaged by the housekeeper at Denton Park because the child would not warm to the new governess, and would not speak in the mornings and spent her afternoons pulling up bulbs in the garden as if she bore the garden a personal grievance. Margaret had not tried to make her stop. She had sat down beside her in the dirt and asked what the bulbs had done to deserve it, and Cecily had looked at her for a long moment and then told her, with the gravity of a child reporting a genuine crime, that they grew where they liked and never asked permission. After that, they had understood each other perfectly. Lord Denton himself had been largely absent that summer. He came and went from the park on business. Margaret did not inquire after, and when he was present he was civil in the particular way of a man who has taught himself to be civil as a discipline rather than a temperament. He had noticed Cecily's improvement. He had said so to Margaret once, in the corridor outside the schoolroom, in 3 sentences that were exactly sufficient and not one word longer. And she had thought at the time that he was a man who had decided language was a finite resource and did not intend to squander it. She had thought, in her private inventory of him, that he was not cold, but carefully contained the way water is contained in a vessel that knows its own shape. She had not permitted herself to think beyond that inventory. She had been a companion in his household, which meant she was of the house without being of the family, which meant she was precisely the sort of person who did not think beyond inventories. She had left Cecily a sleeping child on a September morning, and had not looked back, because looking back was a luxury she could not afford, and she had told herself that the child was 7 years old, and children recovered from things. And Cecily would not even remember her by spring. She had been wrong about that. She had known she was wrong about it. Almost immediately. There was a quality to the knowledge of having left a child you loved that does not resolve on its own timetable and is not amenable to practical reasoning. She had carried it north and through the winter and into the spring, and it was still there in the summer, and then through another autumn, a specific weight in a specific place that did not grow lighter with time so much as more familiar, like a stone in a boot that has worn its own hollow. If you have stayed with this story so far, stay a little longer. What comes next is what it was all for. She had been in Harrogate for 11 months when the quarterly charity function was announced at the assembly rooms, and Mrs. Cavendish, whose dinner gowns Margaret had been altering since June, sent word that she required 2 dresses taken in at the waist, and a 3rd let out at the seams, and would Eliza Marsh be so good as to attend the function herself, in case any last-minute adjustment was needed, and there would be payment at the usual rate plus the supper. Margaret had almost declined. She had heard from Mrs. Fowler, who heard such things without seeking them, that Lord Denton's household was expected among the attendees. The quarterly function drew from 3 counties, and Denton Park was not so far. She had told herself the household was large, and Denton himself was not a man who attended charity functions as a rule, and she would keep to the side rooms and the corridor by the ladies' retiring room, and there was no reason at all for the evening to become anything other than an evening's work. She dressed with more care than usual. She noticed herself doing it, and set her brush down and picked it up again. This was the particular cruelty of a pretend self she had come to understand. It did not prevent wanting. It only prevented being seen to want. She pinned her hair in the style Eliza Marsh favored, which was a little more severe than she had once permitted herself, and she put on her good gray cloak, and she walked to the assembly rooms in the November cold with her needle case in her bag, and told herself that the evening would be ordinary. She had not counted on Cecily. The child was in the small anteroom off the main hall, sitting on a bench, with her hands folded and her face arranged in the particular blankness of a child being very well behaved in a situation that required it. She was taller. Her hair was braided more neatly than Margaret remembered. She was wearing a white gown with green ribbon at the cuffs that Margaret recognized because she had helped stitch it herself in another life, from a bolt of fabric the housekeeper had set aside. Margaret stopped in the doorway. She should have turned. She knew she should have turned. She had 11 months of practice at turning and walking and not looking back, and her legs had learned the motion so well that it cost almost nothing. Not loudly. Not with any particular cause. Margaret could see just the quiet overflow of a child who had been very well behaved for a long time and had come to the end of it. And Margaret's hand went to her own pocket before she had decided anything, and she crossed the room and sat down on the bench, and she pressed her own handkerchief into Cecily's hands with the particular fold she always used, the triangle with the corner tucked under. Cecily looked down at the handkerchief. She looked up. She said very quietly, "Miss Colville." Margaret had thought she was prepared for many things. She had thought through most of the possible shapes that exposure might take, and had composed herself against them. She had not thought through this specific shape, which was a small girl's voice in a quiet room, saying her name with neither accusation nor surprise, but only a simple recognition, as if the world had merely corrected a long-standing error. She did not answer. She pressed her hand over Cecily's and said nothing, and the child leaned against her arm, and they sat like that for a long moment, while the sounds of the assembly carried through the wall. It was not until she stood to go that she saw the figure in the corridor doorway. Lord Denton had not moved. He was standing the way he had stood in the churchyard, with his hands loose at his sides and his face very still. But there was something in his eyes now that she had not seen there before, and could not name. Something that sat between grief and fury, and some third thing that had no clean name in the register of polite society. He did not speak. He looked at Cecily, who had tucked her chin and was examining the handkerchief with close attention, and then he looked at Margaret, and his jaw moved once. She told him she had something to attend to in the retiring room. She told him this and walked away, which was what she had always done, and she told herself that it was still the correct thing, and she pressed her hands flat against the corridor wall, once she was out of his sight, and stood very still in the dark until she could breathe evenly. He came to find her at the end of the evening. The room she had been given to work in was a small anteroom off the east corridor, plain and practical, with one good lamp and a straight-back chair and a side table she had spread with her needle case and her pins and the 3 gowns in their various states of correction. She had been sitting there for 40 minutes, working steadily, and not thinking, which was the closest to peace she had found in Harrogate, when the door opened. He stood in the passage and looked at her with the direct, undeflectable attention she had forgotten he was capable of. He said in a voice she had never heard him use before, that she would please do him the courtesy of not walking away again. He said this quietly, as he said most things, but there was something under the quiet that she felt rather than heard, something that had been under pressure for some time. She said she was not Miss Colville. She said this firmly, looking at a point above his left shoulder, which was a technique she had developed over 11 months for conversations that required the appearance of calm. He said he knew what she was not. He came inside and closed the door. He did not sit. He stood near the window, and he looked at his own hands for a moment in the way of a man who is deciding something and has almost decided it. The silence that followed was the kind that accumulates behind a long fall of water, pressing and present and full of something not yet arrived. She looked at him then. She had not looked at him directly in the churchyard, and she had not looked at him in the anteroom, and she understood now that she had been avoiding it, because she had known that looking at him directly would make the thing inside her chest do what it was presently doing, which was contract painfully, and then expand into something very much like grief. He was still wearing the drawing in his coat pocket. She could see the corner of it. She had drawn those lines in the kitchen garden at Denton Park in June. In the last summer before everything, with Cecily leaning against her shoulder, telling her she had drawn the apple tree too small. She had drawn it twice and kept the second version, and now here it was in his coat pocket, which meant that some version of that June morning had been traveling with him to her grave and back for 9 months, which was a fact she did not know what to do with. She asked him what he wanted her to say. He said he wanted her to sit down, and then he wanted her to tell him everything. And he said these things in the level way he had of speaking, that gave his words the quality of a ground that does not shift. And because she was very tired, and because 11 months of being Eliza Marsh had cost her something she had not fully acknowledged until this moment, she sat down. She told him about Gerald, and the solicitor, and the document on the table. She told him about the river and the cloak, and the 8 miles to the coaching road. She told him about the seamstress's room in Harrogate and the landlady, who asked no questions. She told him about the drawing which she had kept, which she was glad he had found, because she had drawn it for Cecily, and it should be somewhere Cecily could see it. He listened without moving. She had expected interruption, or the particular redirecting attention of a man who has decided he knows where a story is going. He did not interrupt. He was very still, the way he had been still in the churchyard, and she found it easier than she had anticipated to say the things she had not said to anyone, because his stillness had the quality of a held thing, contained and steady, rather than the stillness of indifference. When she was finished, she reached for her needle case. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was arranging something politic to say, the kind of measured response available to a man of his rank when a woman of her circumstances has placed a substantial inconvenience at his feet. Then he said, without looking up from the floor, that his wife had died while he was in London managing a creditor's claim against the eastern acres of the estate. He said Eleanor had gone into labor 3 weeks early, and he had not come home in time. He said it in the flat, careful way of someone who has rehearsed a fact, until it no longer sounds like a wound, but she heard the wound beneath the rehearsal, the specific cost of a thing stated too evenly. He said he had been very efficient about the creditor's claim. He said it was settled within the week. He paused. A log shifted in the grate and sent a small cascade of sparks against the fireback, and neither of them moved. He said almost to himself that Cecily had not spoken easily to anyone in the house until Margaret's arrival in May. He said the governess before Margaret had reported the child difficult. He said he had believed this and had not investigated further, because it was more convenient to believe the governess than to sit in the garden and ask what the bulbs had done to deserve it. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. She understood the particular grammar of people who have decided, at some cost, that efficiency is a reliable substitute for presence, and have since learned otherwise. They were speaking the same language, she and he, which was the language of people who have made the practical choice in the moment that required the human one, and have lived in the aftermath of it, and have not yet found the version of themselves that existed before the choice was made. She reached across and put her hand over his, once, briefly, as she had put her hand over Cecily's. It was a small act, and she did not elaborate it. She felt his hand turn, very slightly, under hers. She stood, took up her things, and told him that she intended to leave Harrogate at the end of the month. She said she thought that was wisest. She said it without entirely meaning it, which was perhaps visible to him because he looked at her for a moment with an expression she did not catalogue, and then looked away. He did not argue. He nodded once, and let her go. She told herself in the cold passage that it was still the correct thing. She told herself this twice. Gerald Colville arrived in Harrogate 2 days later. She did not know how he had learned. She suspected Mrs. Sellow. Tanner from the Charity Committee, who had been present in the anteroom doorway for the last few seconds before Cecily said her name, and who was the kind of woman who treated information as a commodity to be traded rather than kept. Gerald came to the dressmaker's shop on the High Street on a Wednesday morning and he was smiling. He was always smiling. This was something she had forgotten. He sat in the chair across from her cutting table, and he told her pleasantly that she had made things very complicated. He told her that an inquest had returned a verdict of accidental death in her name, that the Colville estate had been properly conveyed, and that certain documents pertaining to the estate's prior accounts were of interest to a magistrate in York who had an appetite for discrepancies in estate records. He said he would very much like her to continue being Eliza Marsh. He said this was the simplest solution for everyone, and his smile did not move, and Margaret understood that he had spent 11 months growing more confident in the absence of her. She was no one now, he said. She had made herself no one. It was almost kind, he said, that the world had accommodated her. She said she would think about it. She waited until he had gone, listened to the sound of his boots on the step and his carriage moving away in the street, and then she sat at her cutting table for a long time, with her hands in her lap and the bolts of fabric arranged around her in their silent rows. The gaslight on the high street moved in the wind. Outside the window, a cat crossed the yard below. She was no one now. She had been no one before, and she could be no one again. She had grown quite practiced at it. And yet something about sitting in the shop in the November evening, with Gerald's pleasantness still in the air like a particular kind of cold, made the prospect feel different than it had in the first weeks of Eliza Marsh. It felt, she recognized, like surrender rather than escape. The distinction mattered, though she had spent 11 months convincing herself it did not. She put on her cloak and walked to the address where Lord Denton was lodging, and she knocked. And when she was shown in, she told him what Gerald had said. She told him she intended to go north. She had heard there was work in Durham. He was standing at the window with his back to the room, and he did not turn. The fire had been built up well, and the room was warm, considerably warmer than she was accustomed to in November. And she noticed this, the way you notice comfort when you are about to leave it. His coat was on the chair by the door. The drawing was nowhere visible. She told him about Gerald and the smile and the documents pertaining to the estate's prior accounts and the magistrate in York, and she told him in the same tone she used for everything that could not be helped, which was steady and without ornament. She said she was not asking anything of him. She said she understood that his position made any connection to her present difficulty, as a woman who had legally died and had debts and a fraudulent estate conveyance in her name, a complication he had not sought and had no obligation to sustain. He said nothing. She said she thought it was better this way. She said she had asked too much of too many people's patience already, and she would not burden his household further, and she was grateful for his discretion. She picked up her gloves from the table where she had set them. Her hands were steady. She was proud of how steady they were. He said without turning, "You will put those gloves down." She put them down. She waited. The fire in the room was low, and the light was gray, and the silence was the heaviest thing in it. He turned, and she saw his face clearly for the first time that evening, and what was in it was not cold, and was not distant, and was not the particular controlled composure she had catalogued across all the months she had known him. It was the face of a man who had made a decision and found it arriving with a force he had not anticipated. He said, "You will not go to Durham." She said, "You cannot stop me." He said, "No. But I can do what I should have done 3 days ago." He crossed to the writing desk and took out paper and wrote 2 letters, and he called for his man to carry them, and he told her he would need 3 days, and he asked her to give him that. Only that. She looked at his face. She looked at the drawing, which was on the writing desk beside the inkwell, which meant he had taken it from his pocket and placed it there, which meant he had been looking at it. She said she would stay 3 days. The quarterly charity assembly took place on a Friday evening, and Margaret was there because he had asked her to be, and because she had given 3 days, and they had not run out. She stood near the east wall in her gray cloak, which was the same gray cloak she had worn to the churchyard, because she had owned it long enough that it had become hers, in the way only much-used things become yours, and she watched the room fill. Gerald arrived at 8:30. He was with Harwick, which she had not expected, and the sight of Harwick's particular way of standing, wide and proprietorial, sent a coldness through her that she managed, as she managed most things, by standing very still and breathing evenly. Lord Denton arrived at 8:30, and 3 minutes. He came in through the west entrance, not the main door, and he was accompanied by a man she did not recognize. A compact man in a dark coat who had the particular steadiness of a person accustomed to delivering difficult information in public settings. Gerald saw her. She watched him see her, watched the smile arrange itself, watched him begin to move across the room in her direction with the particular unhurried confidence of a man who has calculated that everyone present is already on his side. Lord Denton crossed Gerald's path in 2 strides. He did not raise his voice. He spoke to Gerald in a tone that required Gerald to lean slightly forward to hear, and she was close enough to see the color change in Gerald's face as he listened. The compact man in the dark coat was producing a document from his case. Gerald's hand tightened on his glove. The room had begun to notice. Rooms always did. It was one of the functions they served. Lady Harriet So, who had been standing near the fireplace with the particular composure of a woman who had arranged herself to maximum advantage in this specific social setting, turned her head. An elderly gentleman by the window turned his head. 3 people on the supper room side turned their heads. Lord Denton handed the document to Gerald without a word. Margaret watched Gerald read it. She watched him read it again. She watched his smile become something else, something that had the same shape as the smile but was hollow at the center, the way a hat still holds its form after the wearer is gone. The compact man spoke. "Ras," he spoke quietly, and for only a short time, but she heard the words estate accounts and fraudulent conveyance, and the name of the magistrate in York, and she heard Gerald say something in a low voice, and she heard the compact man's response, which was courteous and final. Then Lord Denton turned. He crossed the room toward her, and the room watched him do it, because rooms always watched him when he moved with intention, because there was something in the manner of a man who has been very still for a very long time, and has now decided to move that compels attention, and Margaret stood very still with her hands at her sides and waited. He stepped in front of her, he said in a voice pitched for the room because he was a man who understood how rooms worked. "Margaret Colville is alive, and she is mine to protect." The room held its breath. Gerald did not speak. Harwick made a sound and was quietly absorbed into the part of the room near the west entrance by the compact man, who appeared to have had some experience managing such absorptions. Lady Harriet turned back to the fireplace and contemplated the mantel with a thoroughness she had not previously devoted to it. The room exhaled. Margaret looked at him. He was looking back at her with his face very still and his jaw set and his hands, she noticed, not entirely steady. She said very quietly, "You had 3 days." "I am punctual," he said, "in the matters that count." It was not quite a declaration. It was something better than a declaration. It was a man who had learned at considerable personal cost the difference between efficiency and presence, choosing presence. She did not answer him then. She gave him her hand. The legal matter resolved itself with something approaching the orderliness that Gerald had always attributed to his own affairs, and which had in the end served entirely other purposes. The fraudulent conveyance of the Colville estate, documented across 3 sets of accounts that Gerald's solicitor had been keeping rather carelessly under the assumption that Margaret was permanently unavailable to dispute them, occupied a magistrate in York for several weeks and a barrister in Leeds for several more. Gerald did not go to jail. He was, however, corrected in ways that left him quieter, and the practice of the smile, at least in Margaret's vicinity, appeared to have been retired. The estate itself was a different problem. It could not be fully restored. Debts had been paid against it in good faith by parties with no knowledge of the fraud, and the law moved with the deliberateness of something that has been doing its work for a very long time, and sees no reason to hurry. The document with Margaret's death recorded in it was at last amended. A letter was produced from the parish register at Leyburn. A new document was drawn up, and the name on it, in the careful copperplate of a York solicitor who had been practicing for 30 years and had seen most of what there was to see, was Margaret Colville, spinster, of this county, alive and of sound mind. She sat in the solicitor's office and looked at her own name on a document for the first time in over a year. And something in her chest that had been held at a particular angle for 11 months adjusted itself. The churchyard at Leyburn was quiet on the morning she returned to it, with Cecily's hand in hers. The frost had come again, a thin, bright skin over the grass, and the air had the specific quality of November mornings in the north, which is cold and honest and without the pretense of spring. Cecily was 8 now. She was wearing the green-ribboned gown and her good boots, and she walked with the gravity of a child who has been entrusted with something important and knows it. Lord Denton had given it to her the previous evening, rolled in a piece of brown paper, and said she might decide what to do with it. And Cecily had thought about this for a long time, and said she thought it should go back where it came from. Margaret had not asked her what she meant by that. They stopped before the 2 stones. Margaret read both names. Eleanor, Countess of Denton, who had died in February 1812 in her 28th year, and whose stone had a small carved rose at the upper corner, and her own name, still there. Margaret Ann Colville, beloved daughter, taken from us. Cecily looked at it for a long time. She said, "It's not right." Margaret said no. Cecily said, "Will they change it?" Margaret said that she had spoken to the vicar about it and that yes, in time, the stone would be amended. One word chiseled away, or perhaps a line added beneath. She had not yet decided on the precise form. Cecily considered this with the thoroughness she brought to most things. Then she unrolled the drawing and propped it carefully against the base of Eleanor's stone, where the grass was short and the frost had made a small flat place, and she stepped back and looked at it. It was only a kitchen garden in summer. The lines were careful and unhurried, the way someone draws something they expect to look at for a long time. 2 figures were just visible in the background, small and approximate, sitting in the grass. Margaret put her arm around Cecily's shoulders. Lord Denton was waiting at the gate. She could see him from here, his coat dark against the pale stone wall, his hands loose at his sides, his face turned toward them without any attempt at concealment. He was not pretending to look elsewhere. He was looking at them, plainly and steadily, the way he had looked at her in the ante-room and in his lodgings and across a charity assembly room full of people who had turned their heads to watch. She had told him, the night before, that she was not yet certain of very much. She had told him that 11 months of being someone else had left her unsure of her own edges, and that she required time to find them again. He had listened to this with the gravity he brought to most things, and then said, in the level way he had, that he had spent 3 years being very certain of very little, and he had found the conditions survivable and he would not hurry her. She had asked him what he was certain of. He had said, after a moment, that he was certain she had always known her own mind. He said he had watched her across 4 months and then across a year's grief, and he had never known a person less in need of being told who they were. He said this quietly, in the way he said most things that cost him something, which was without ornament or announcement. She had not answered him. She had taken the drawing from the desk and given it to Cecily, and that had been answer enough. Cecily reached up now and took her hand, and they walked together toward the gate, and the frost crunched under their boots, and the morning was cold and honest and without pretense. He held the gate for them both. She stopped beside him for a moment. She did not look at him directly. She looked at Eleanor's stone and at her own, and at the small drawing propped in the frost. She said, "You kept it." He said, "I did." She said, "Even then." He said, "Even then." The gate closed behind them with a sound that was small and final and exactly right, the way the closing of a thing can be, when it is not the end of something, but only the end of waiting. The drawing stayed where Cecily had placed it for 2 days, until the frost came hard enough that Margaret retrieved it and brought it inside, and it hung from that winter onward in the study at Denton Park, in a frame Lord Denton had commissioned from the cabinet maker in the village, beside the window that looked over the kitchen garden. In the spring, the 2 figures in the background were visible only if you knew they were there, small and approximate and sitting in the grass as if they had been sitting that way for a very long time, and had no intention of leaving. The stone at Leyburn was amended in the February, the vicar being a precise man who liked his records correct. The line was added beneath the name, in smaller letters, at Margaret's instruction. In error only, she is living. From the window above the kitchen garden, on the afternoons when the light came in at a particular angle, if you looked up from whatever you were doing, you could see it all together, the drawing, the garden it remembered, and through the glass beyond, the garden itself. Cecily called from somewhere below, her voice carrying the uncomplicated happiness of a child who has decided the world has corrected its most significant error and may now be trusted. She was here. She was at last precisely where she was. If this story stayed with you, leave a word in the quiet below. She would not have asked for your attention, but she has earned it, and you gave it freely, and that is a thing worth naming.